las intervenciones de la señora Angela Mee, de la Oficina de las Naciones Unidas contra la Droga y el Delito, y el señor Jim Lynch, de la Universidad de Maryland, Estados Unidos de América. Tiene el uso de la voz, señora Mee.
Thank you. And they were supposed to be here, the Professor Alex Piquero, because the reason was to talk about a process that was done in the US. There was a US Academy of Science panel, it's called, where, if I understand correctly, is a panel, a group of academics, right? More or less, yeah, and also practitioners. There were people also from FBI, from management, yes, and also from government institutions. That they really met a lot. They had a lot of meetings, a lot of research done to really to discuss how to modernize crime statistics in the United States. And there is a report, they did two reports. One report was more focused on the implementation of the classification of crime in the United States. And the second report was more really broadly discussing what should happen in the US in process in terms of modernization of crime statistics. And I was one of the reviewers of that of the report, and I really find it very interesting ideas that I thought it would be good that we can, as the end of the conference, for you to go home to, you know, to have some ideas on how to modernize crime statistics. But Alex could not come, so we asked somebody else that was part of the panel, Jim, and we said we can use this instead of just making a formal presentation on what the panel did or not. It's just to have a conversation with Jim. And so I had written a few questions. Jim deleted the hardest question. But why I thought it was interesting to have this conversation with Jim is because Jim has had different hats. And particularly, he was the director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics, so in a way, you know, aware of what it means of the process and of dealing with a national crime statistics system. But then he was also the chair of the criminology department, and so from the other side of the research. So the first question that I have for Jim is, what is the definition, in your view, of modernizing crime statistics? First, with your hat of the Director of Bureau of Justice Statistics, where I guess, you know, there's certain, and then the definition that you will give as a researcher.
First of all, I'm going to get Alex sooner or later. It's I think from the point of view of BJS, I think the National Academy panel had it pretty much correct in terms of the thing that we needed to modernize. As a number of people have mentioned, we hadn't modernized our crime classification since 1929, really, in any extensive way. So we're dealing with an antiquated system that just stayed in place, and that the police chiefs themselves were saying, this is not informative, you know, and so I think that increasing the scope of the crimes that we captured so that you have a wide array of things that are affecting people's life, like cybercrime, like stalking, like things that, like fraud, like various forms of credit card kind of offenses. So they're high volume, as many of the speakers here had said, high volume, and we were just focusing on rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, and that was, you know, that was salient in 29, so we needed to expand the scope. I think that was absolutely clear. We had to include these new crimes. I think that the second thing that I thought was useful in not only in the outcome but in the process was that we opened up the publics that were included in the definition of what we should collect. So in 1929, it was a few elites, like academic elites, like one or two. but a bunch of police chiefs, pretty much. And they decided what was going to be in the index that stayed with us for the next 80 years. And so this time there were a lot more publics who wanted to be included, so that were interested in crime. So it wasn't just the police, or it wasn't just the courts. It was other people. We must have spent 5 or 6 meetings just hearing from people who wanted to have a voice in this kind of thing. So I think that's an aspect of modern crime statistics, is that it isn't just the people who provide them who are the audience for them. And so I think that creates both benefits and liabilities, I think. So, but I think we have to broaden the governance of crime statistics. And I think that is to say, who has the say about what is collected. And I think so. I think that was another feature that was important. And I think I think that also the idea of metrics, and this is something we didn't do in that report very well, but there are a lot of changes in the way in which the data are manipulated. I don't mean that in a negative way. The amount of metadata made available with it, tools and other things, which I'm not universally in favor of, but they are, these are modern ways to disseminate these kinds of things. I think that is those are all aspects of a modern crime statistical system that I could go on, but some of your other questions about, I think that you mentioned to me, I think I can work some of those other things in there. But I think, so the scope, I think the access, both in terms of getting the data and having governance capability, I think, and also the making it available, in many more ways. And I think those are some of the major features of a modern crime statistical system that we didn't have, in some cases still don't have. But from a researcher's point of view, that's easy. They want more. That's all modern crime statistics means more data on more crimes, and they also want it easy, and they want to be able to take the core data on crime and link it to lots of other data that can be used for explanatory purposes. When you're trying to explain crime or trying to explain police reporting or victim service use or whatever you happen to be explaining, they want more data, and that requires some things. That if you're going to preserve confidentiality of people's data, if you're going to get to share the data from other places, especially medical data and things like that, you're going to need to build arrangements so that they can get access to them, but at the same time preserve confidentiality, and they need to get it quickly. It's not that they apply and wait 6 years and then they get it. And so I think that academics want more and different, and they want it now, pretty much.
I think those, I don't know, those of you that where we had, there was one of the parallel session presenting a book from the Inter-American Development Bank. And Jose Antonio presented, and he said statistics, which I thought was really a brilliant way of picturing it. Statistics is like water. And then, everyone needs water, anyone, and then assume that water is always there. You just need to open the tap, and then you expect always, the water to come out. But there is very often very little appreciation that just so that everyone opens the tap and they have the water, there is a huge system behind. that you don't see if you just every day you go there and then just open the tab. And I think in that sense, it was interesting to see, from the institutional point of view. I think when you are from a National Statistical Office, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, I think you tend to focus on the pipes. You tend to focus, you say, well, I want to make sure that the pipes work, that everything is in place, that I have the resources to do this. While I think the researchers just want to have the water a lot, clean, and soon. So my next question is, among all of us here, and I think here is the fourth conference, and I really, even if I think from the first conference that we had, and how even the issues that we are presenting and so on, even in 8 years, I think there has been an evolution. But there is always this feeling that in a way, crime statistics, I'm not talking about criminology, but crime statistics in the way we are thinking today is relatively new. Compared to other statistics like health statistics. I mean, the example is the classification. I mean, there is an international classification of disease that now I think is the 10th version. It was, I don't know, 100 years. I mean, they started to talk about the classification 100 years ago. I mean, we developed a classification for crime 6-7 years ago. So, so why do you think crime statistics is such a baby?
I'm trying not to say insulting things about certain disciplines and things, so I won't. I think that, but I don't think. And I'll give you some examples why I think that way. I think that the science base of crime is not as deep as the science base of medicine or economics or other things, because, or even some of the education disciplines. I think that people talk about evidence-based, and you think that people will, for example, in the state of Maryland, I got a grant from the Arnold Foundation, and I can offer people free research, as long as they give me the data. So that's the quid pro quo, is that kind of thing. And you'd be surprised how people won't do things for free. They'd rather watch their kids play Little League, I mean, so the idea of people hungry for data is, I think, in the legal area, that they're not used to that. And so I think in Salome presentation she was making, and other people made the same point, the idea of utilization, I think Alan Beck was talking about utilization, the idea of once people get it, once they understand that data can be used, but I think in this particular policy sphere, there is not as much. They're not as used to that. So, for example, there's a group in the states called, I think it's the state labor education. It's a thing called SLED, where the Department of Education started centers throughout the country at the state level, and they link data from a child's education, from primary school to secondary school to college to their first entry into the labor force. And they've linked it all up, and 37 states have it, and they spent $199 million on it, but they have the data they need to do educational planning, because they're linking their inputs to the outputs, and so I think that somebody cared enough to do that. In the state of Maryland, the police don't know what the sentence is for the person that they arrested. You would think it would be the same thing, that the results of your efforts are downstream, and that they'd want to know. Well, it turns out they do want to know, but they're so in the habit of not. And Comey, the FBI director, he was out. The reason that NCSX got started is that he was outraged when someone was shot in St. Louis, Missouri, and he had no information on it whatsoever. He said, I can go and I can find out how many people are watching what movie on the weekend, but I can't know how many police officers shot citizens, and that drove him mad. So he dumped $145 million on that kind of thing. So, I mean, when people are made cognizant of what data can do for them, I think it's like your faucet kind of thing. They expect it to be there. And I think it's interesting when they're shocked that it's not. And that shock lasts for a few days, but if you're director of the FBI, that's enough, you know. So I think that in some places and other disciplines and policy areas, that the idea of science, the idea that policy should be based upon basic descriptive information, at least, is not as imbued in the courts. God help us. The courts, you know, the courts are the least. I don't know. I was so impressed with the Peruvian sort of integrated database. Is just amazing. I was envious that if we could get the courts do not want to be held accountable. They don't want to share their data. They don't want their data displayed. So that's a very powerful entity in the criminal justice system that basically, in the United States anyway, refuses to engage in the normal kind of accountability that we're used to. So I think if I've repeated myself, I think, yeah.
No, I think if I can echo a little bit on 2 points. I think you mentioned when, you know, for example, lawyer, and I have seen also in some of the research or you know, think tank and so on that you see to explain crime. Sometimes you have this lawyer perspective, and the lawyer perspective is not, if there is any lawyer in the room, please let me know.
Mario.
Yeah. The perspective is that you want to prove that somebody is innocent or you know, guilty, and then you try to find the information that will prove that, while the science is the opposite. Mm-hmm. You first want to have the information to understand whether someone is, and that is a that indeed in a way doesn't bring the interest to bring really quality information and the other thing is that another thing, you know, when you say in terms also the understanding of criminology, the first time when I started getting exposed to crime statistics and so on, I remember that the average, for example, the European homicide rate was calculated as a simple average of countries. I was shocked as a social scientist and a statistician. But they say, we always did it like this, and it was like, you don't understand anything about criminology, and so that's the way to do it. But my reaction was, yes, wow, that's the only science that I know of, social science, that would do something like this. So that's, again, just to offend also the criminologists that are in the room. So another question is, I thought, if you had $1 billion, okay, Trump give you $1 billion, and they say, I'll give you this to modernize crime statistics, what would you do?
I'd move to Lima. I think that, I mean, it's hard for any normal human being to wrap their mind around $1 billion, but let's say a lot of money.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm going to reflect the United States experience because that's all that I know, and so that's going to be a limitation on it. I think that and again, I'm probably thinking too small, you know, about this, but I think that what I would like to see would be I would spend a lot of money on a variety of problems, I guess, is what I would do. I think I would spend a lot of money on research and development, because the earth does not stand still, you know, and so, you know, we talked about error structure and things like that, and we talked about survey research, which I grew up in survey research, you know, and I loved it, you know, and it was so knowable in that sense, and there was so much research done, you know, about what techniques work and what don't, you know, and everything else in it. And it had a real scientific emphasis, and it was a sort of a discipline unto itself. So you knew a lot of things about that, but now we're faced with some real struggles, you know. And as I said to you, and I say to Ed, you know, the older I get, the more I repeat myself about the same thing. But you get that I think that crime statistics, the fundamental heart of crime statistics, is a self-report measure of crime, where the citizens have the right to define the crime situation. And so you don't want, no offense to law enforcement, they do their job, they do things, but you want the citizens to have direct input into the definition of crime and the criminal justice response. But that's being threatened at this point in time by low response rates, by this overwhelming amount of asking for information, you know, that we've totally changed. First in the 70s it went to telephones and we all changed accordingly, and now it went to, you know, landlines were a thing of the past, so people, but everything's just speeding up in terms of information technology and the demands put on people. So I would take a big chunk of that $1 billion, and I would get a lot of smart people, and I would have them think about how we preserve this thing that's so important. So to have a self-report measure of crime of some sort from a systematically sampled subset of the citizens, because I think that's very important. I think that I think there are a lot of I think the biggest problem for the United States is that we're a federated republic. Maybe I got republic wrong, but we're federated anyway. Mexico's federated, but we're federated. There's a difference. I mean, we have virulent federalism, and I think that I think the state is a powerful unit in our form of government, and I think that it would be better if we had strong state statistical capabilities, because they can pass laws that require people to report, whereas it's more difficult for the federal government to do that. So I think having strong statistical agencies at the state level that the Federal Bureau of Justice Statistics coordinates, sets standards, and does the usual things that a coordinating entity would do. I think, and they would also coordinate the exchange of the administrative record, and so they would be a force, you know. So I would take some of that money and set that up, you know. And I think that would be I also would engage in infrastructure building. I know that means a lot of things. Frankly, I'd love to make some roads work again. Our infrastructures, and they haven't passed the bill at all, and so there we go. But the idea of your informational infrastructure, you know, so that we have 18,000 police departments in our country, so that some of them have, the New York Police Department has 37,000 members. Maybe it's 43 now, something like that, but if you count civilians. Okay, so that's a big, I know you all have, some of you have national police forces where are bigger than that, but I think that's one city has that. And then we have thousands of Andes and Opis. You know, this was a TV program about a guy who lived, never mind, it's an American reference kind of thing, but where you only have two people. You know, you have the sheriff and you have the deputy, and that's it. You know, so you have this wide variety, and so we need a statistical infrastructure so that when we talk about management information systems that can support the ICCS, that everybody can have them. You know, that everybody has them, that they're in the cloud, they're somewhere, but everybody has them. And so the complicated decisions and things like that become simplified with drop-down menus and all that kind of thing. So we have many countries, Peru has many, many countries, both culturally and everything else. It's my first time here, and I was amazed at just how much variety there's. But we've got 50 states that never want to go in the same direction and everything else. So I think that if we build that infrastructure, we're not going to get the sharing that we need to get, and the sophisticated delivery and that kind of thing, if we don't build that kind of thing. So I think those are, I'm still probably millions short of that, you know, but I think those are some things that I would do, I think.
No, so if I go with the metaphor of the water, I think what you're saying, you would invest on the pipes.
Yeah, the pipes.
Yes.
You know, absolutely the pipes. Yeah. You know, it's.
Yeah. So, if anyone has a spare billion, then you know that it can be well used. So the last question. So, in light of the US experience that you had to build, the way how also crime statistics has been built, I mean, has been the model for many. The victimization survey has been really the first national victimization survey, and I think even here in the region, and not only in this region, in all regions, I think everyone has built their victimization survey also with the good experience and testing that of the US. So, what tips would you give to countries outside the US, based on, you know, the lessons learned?
Well, I'm not sure how applicable lessons are across countries. You know, I think there's a core set of problems that statistical agencies have. I mean, I think you have to be independent, you know, which is a much undervalued. And I think that, I mean, I know it's not in the world, but for incumbents to the position, you come to the position sort of starry-eyed, and all of a sudden your boss says, you know, I don't think we ought to publish that because, you know, there's an election coming up, and you have to say, too bad. You know, I mean, that kind of I mean, it can be hubris in some ways, but you know, as a federal statistical agency, you have that obligation to do that. And I think, and because all of these things are crucial to having a viable statistical system. You have to be perceived as independent so that people share their data with you and they believe it when you see it. So all that we're, you know, all of the things that we're dependent upon for existence and for credibility and for legitimacy, you know, are based on things like independence or the perception of independence and equality, that you have to have quality. And I think that timeliness, all the usual things that are expected of a statistical agency. I think that I guess if I have a tip, it's that I don't care where you are. Those principles are the principles that you have to acknowledge, you have to pursue. Otherwise, it just won't work, you know, and the statistics won't accomplish the goals that they're supposed to. And you know, a lot of them are technical. A lot of the problems like speed and all that stuff is to accuracy, and all that stuff is technical. But independence is not. I mean, if you're like Enehi, you guys are ironclad, you know. I mean, you guys have a note from God, you know, that they leave you alone and stuff. But it's not always the case. So I think of all the tips, I think that I could even say to people who succeeded me, I think with the idea of independence and the perception of independence is the most important thing.
I would argue that this is also important at the international level. It's the same. And again, if I can go back to the metaphor of the water, is that at a certain point, that tub, people will not even open anymore because they think that there is no clean water. Because it's also then at the end is the reputation. I mean, the preamble of the fundamental principle of official statistics, they say to keep the trust on statistics. Then you have to have all of this. So, you know, you can build beautiful pipes, but then if nobody then at a certain point, because they think, and maybe you can start, and it could only be an incident that there was no clean water, but only the perception that you can open that tap and you can have unclean water, then it will make people not to open it anymore.
Well, you know, can I spend some more of that billion?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I think you mentioned something that made me think about this thing, and that is I had a friend who was the head of the Education Statistical Agency, Jack Buckley, He's a really smart guy, and he for years he was trying to get data on schools and things from the state of Florida when he was head of that agency, and they wouldn't give it to him. After he left the Obama administration, went to the college board. They give him the data now. He's a private entity. They give him the data now. Now that scares me. You know, the idea that when you think that, I always think that the government's imprimatur, that this is the official statistic, you know, is a good thing. And I'm beginning to worry because animosity towards the government, especially in the United States, well, maybe not especially in the United States, there's a lot of that going around. And it could be that I'm just inflexible, you know, but I worry that the official statistics will no longer have a monopoly on truth in this kind of thing. And maybe that ship has already sailed. But I think that does lead to chaos. And maybe there can be new relationships built between private and public. In fact, when we were out as part of this National Academy panel, we were out at Google, and we went to another bunch of private data providers on various statistics, and none of them wanted the federal statistical system to disappear, because that's how they sold their wares. They said, we can tell if it's good because we compare it to the federal statistics. So I thought that was an encouraging sign, but more and more you see these instances where there's distrust of the government and the government's statistics, and that really bothers me. So I'd take get a bunch of smart people with that $1 billion, and I don't know if we can, this thing might be bigger than all that. It's not a technical fix, you know, so.
We have a couple of questions from the audience. In many countries, developed and developing, the issue of security is top priority, and perception, opinions on security seems to have little to do with available data. So what are we doing wrong? So basically that, in all countries, there is, security is always put at the top priority of government. And there is always perception about security that very often doesn't have anything to do with the actual evidence on data. So what are we doing wrong?
I've seen in the United States where people's perception of crime has not kept pace with the reality of crime. So, I mean, there's always, the interesting thing was that, it would get out of whack for a while, and then when it would come back into alignment and that sort of thing. So that, I think in many of those instances, I think, first of all, you have to get the data out there. And so the question becomes, are the data that are out there questionable? So are they not persuasive? So if you don't trust the police, what have we done when in the 60s and the 70s in the United States, they didn't trust the police? Well, what'd they do? They started victimization surveys. So they went to another type of data that was not subject to the same kinds of constraints and errors that the other data were, and seemed to work. So I guess part of the idea would be, is there something about the data that you're putting out that is not persuasive, or they don't get it, they don't see it, you're not putting it out correctly. I mean, you could go through a checklist of things that, and then you should not leave out the possibility that people are mad at something else and expressing it in a certain policy domain. But I wouldn't accept that explanation until we've ruled out a lot of the others. Yeah.
There is this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and I think basically what he says is that as human beings, we base our perception very often not on rational issues. And so it's just that the perception sometimes is made out, as we are human beings, how we think. And the last question, and then because we have only 1 minute. Which are the correct strategies to count on with the commitment and availability of systematized information of the criminal justice system?
So you're asking to privilege one method or one indicator over the others?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That would be an awful position to be put in, to pick one thing, you know, and because they all have different strengths, you know, okay, this is going to be kind of a weakened. They have no, I don't. I'm an academic. I don't have to decide anything. They have. I would go with this is an old. I would go with what's closest to the event. You know, I think, but with a caveat. I mean, so closeness to the event of crime would be but we know that some of the methodologies that are closest to the event are methodologies that are threatened in some ways. So I think if we can't think of alternative ways of doing that, then I would move to the next, you know, the next closest thing.
Well, really, we are at the end. I really thank Jim first because he agreed to do this at very last moment, and then it has been really great. Yeah, it was fun. Yes, thank you. A round of applause.
Muchas gracias por esta interesante discusión a los panelistas. En unos momentos más se llevará a cabo la ceremonia de clausura.